Hello and welcome to the Homeless Consultant channel. My name is Paul B. I am the Homeless Consultant. This is the sixth existential threat to the United States of America, junk science. If you have not already watched my previous videos on this topic, I recommend at least watching my analysis of threat number one, which is cults and cult mentality. It's going to be crucial to understanding junk science. I would also recommend, if possible, watch my overall general video, which is 50 greatest existential threats to America. Because this junk science infiltrates a lot of the others that you'll find, a lot of the other 50 threats. Now, when it comes to junk science, it is one of those things like student loan racketeering where I could spend hours and hours and hours going over this. So I'm going to move as quickly as I can. I have come up with a script and it's very long, and for me to try to squeeze this in an hour is going to be a trick. Let me begin by pointing out that from the time I was a very young child, I had music heroes on one wall and I had science heroes on the other. So one wall had Eddie Van Halen and Jimi Hendrix and such. The other wall had Isaac Newton, Johann Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, and even Einstein, even though I'm not as much of a fan of Einstein at this point as I was back then. Among my greatest influences as a kid were Carl Sagan, who made the Cosmos PBS series and book, and particularly Isaac Asimov, who was a writer about science. He wasn't a scientist, but he was reading almost all of Asimov's books, and he wrote hundreds of them. When I was a kid, I was very young, way before I ever learned this stuff in school. Reading Asimov's books is what I would probably credit with my one thing I'm pretty good at doing when I'm able to prepare, which I'm not so much living in a car. All my research is packed away. I'm pretty good at taking topics and explaining them to other people, especially in writing in a way that they understand where they might have had trouble elsewhere. I hope I can accomplish that here. It's difficult because I have to move fast. I have to be at work in an hour and a half. All my research is in storage. I live in a car, and a lot of this is from memory. I had to write out this whole script from memory, even though I have, book-length manuscripts that I've written about this topic in storage, because this is something I've been dealing with my entire adult life. My point about when I was a kid with Carl Sagan got me interested in science. He was a popularizer of science. Isaac Asimov was such a fantastic writer of explaining what scientists believed at the time. And of course, unfortunately, I didn't know any better, so I just believed it as well. And of course, I saw a lot of holes in it, and I scratched my head, but I assumed that these experts knew something I didn't know. Once I get into graduate school and I started meeting PhDs and working with them, that's when I realized that these people are utterly incompetent in many cases, and that what I had been told since I was a child were a pack of lies. And also, my other research into cults and cult mentalities and other things helped me to understand how the cult of academia and its major tool, junk science, has completely reshaped the world throughout the 20th century and going forward in a very bad direction. When I was a kid, maybe 10 years old even, I would get on my bicycle, I would ride from home. We lived up in a subdivision on a hill. I would ride down to the library, and they had a kids section and an adult section. I consumed almost every book on the topic of science and biographies of anyone related to science and technology in that library. Every single book. And I did so long before these topics even came up in school. So I was always ahead of my teachers throughout school, and it frustrated them to no end. Including, in fact, in computer science, they wouldn't let me take the computer class because I already knew more than the teachers did. And this is back in the 80s when almost nobody had a computer. I didn't even have a computer, but I loved it so much, I borrowed a computer, I used the ones they had at school and reverse engineered the software, and I learned how they work on my own. And then, of course, Peter Norton's books came out and stuff like that. So what I'm getting at is that science is something I love. It was on one of my walls. It consumed me as a child. I love legitimate science, and because of that, I hate corrupted junk science. It is absolutely despicable, and especially when you see what it's being used for, to make money, to push agendas that are full of lies and trying to manipulate and oppress people. I hate junk science. One of the things you hear in a lot of my videos, especially lately, is the anti-smoking industry, which to me is the granddaddy of all modern junk science. The consequence of that alone is millions upon millions of people who have suffered and died from horrific diseases. And then to add insult to injury on that, while they're making trillions of dollars a year off this fraud, they go to the families of the victims who suffered and died there, and they tell them, we're your friend. What you need to do is look at these people who are selling tobacco and using tobacco, and you need to hate them with all your heart and soul, because that's what killed your loved one. The problem is, that isn't what killed their loved one. So not only are they stealing all these people's money, they have set cancer research back so far that I don't know how we're ever even going to recover, to be honest. We should have had effective treatments, if not cures, for cancer already, period. Anti-smokers are the ones who didn't want that. The more people who suffer and die from cancer, the more their agenda gets pushed. They have evidence and proof. And you can forget about the ridiculous evidence of your own senses, where as smoking rates have just plummeted, they claim that cancer is becoming a more serious issue than ever before. No one loves cancer more than anti-smokers. They have benefited from it more than anyone else. And they have even converted the victims and their families into people. You look at these ads, these sick and disgusting ads where they exploit these people who are suffering from a disease that should have been solved already if it wasn't for the anti-smoking industry. That lady who had her jaw missing, they put those ads on there, and she goes out and condemns all these other smokers when the evidence seems to show that had nothing to do with it. I hate junk science. I hate it. Another thing I despise is cults. And junk science, through the cult of academia, is a combination of two things I absolutely despise. Let's leave the introduction at that because there's so much information to cover here. But I wanted you to know how much this one in particular means to me. I spent my entire life, all the way up till I started graduate school, loving, studying this, defending it, and it was a pack of lies the whole time. They stole my youth from me as well. I want to start out by mentioning something that happened maybe a couple years ago. I went to a local restaurant. I was just in there with my computer, just researching whatever I was doing. And it was the middle of the night, so there was only one other guy over there, looked like a student. I think he was from Ethiopia. Somehow we got chatting. Turns out he's Muslim. We got on the topic of religion pretty quickly, and it turned into a debate. So we dropped what we were doing, and we sat down, and we hunkered down in our bunkers, and we started going at this debate. But it was a friendly debate. It was very heated, and we didn't pull any punches. We did everything. Now, maybe it's just me, but I think I won the debate. But the thing is, at the end of it, we both had beliefs, from my Christian perspective, from his Muslim perspective. We both had very solid beliefs, and we were both pretty well trained to defend our beliefs, as much as is possible in this case. At the end of it, we didn't just shake hands. We talked, we hugged, we traded contact information, and the reason is because we were both seeking the truth. Now, yes, I would love to see him understand what I understand about Christianity, because I want him to be saved. From his perspective, he wants me to understand what he believes about Islam, because he wants me to be, the equivalent of saved in that religion. So we both cared about each other deeply. We both cared about the other person. So it was full of respect, even if we argued and maybe even got a bit heated at times. In the end, we could do that. We could shake hands and hug, and we could trade information and have great respect for each other, because we were both seeking truth. Anytime I've had something like that happen with a scientist, it's a completely different matter. You don't hug at the end, you don't trade information. The scientist starts calling you names. If you know what you're talking about and you try to debate with them and you start pointing out these things, they start flipping out, freaking out. They act like a cult member, like if you're debating someone in Scientology, or Jim Jones, Charles Manson, anything like that. At some point, once you've got them cornered, which doesn't take terribly long, they start flipping out. And they start name calling, they start saying, well, you don't know anything about science, you don't have a PhD, and they just go into all their techniques and tactics to extricate themselves from the mess they've gotten themselves into. Nothing like what I experienced with this Muslim fella. Now, from the beginning of time, charlatans have used what we call science today to usurp power and to make money and to build their own what you might call a professional career or their social prestige. Just a general example would be, you have a king of Babylon way back when, 4,000 years ago, king of Babylon. Let's say someone comes up and says, king, I think you should give me, put me second in command of your kingdom. You should give me your wealth. And the king would say, well, why would I do that? You're just a nobody. And you say, well, I'll give you an example of my power. All right, tonight the moon's going to go dark. And the king's like, yeah, whatever. All right. And then that night the moon goes dark. Now, was this person a scientist, or was this just a person who sat and actually observed the natural world long enough and thought about it long enough to figure out the mechanisms of eclipses so that he could predict an eclipse? Well, yeah, there is some science involved in that. In fact, there's a fair amount. That's pretty good science back then. But it was esoteric knowledge. The king had no idea about that. To the king, this was the gods blacking out the sun or something. They didn't know what an eclipse was. They certainly couldn't predict it. So as soon as that happens, one example of that kind of power, and the king calls this guy in here and says, you're second in command of my kingdom, you get half of my riches, you're marrying my daughter. End of story. With that kind of power, with that kind of knowledge of this world, I want you on my team. I want you as an advisor. That's all it takes. But what did that guy really know? He didn't know that much. He didn't understand the mechanisms of the planets going around the sun or anything. He just observed, did a bit of math, and figured out when the eclipses were going to happen. This has been going on forever with science. Junk scientists or legitimate scientists, but what you call astrologers, psychics. I mean, you still have these astrologers and psychics doing the same thing that junk scientists do. All right. Most recent examples in the 20th century of this kind of thing would be something like eugenics, which of course was big in Nazi Germany. Let's put the calipers on their skull, measure the length of their nose, their height, their proportions. This race is inferior, we need to exterminate them, and you have a Holocaust. That came out of science. Oddly enough, the same science that originated the modern anti-smoking movement, which I despise. Another one would be Lysenkoism. If you haven't heard of that, look it up. Lysenkoism. This was some crackpot in the Soviet Union who managed to get Stalin's ear. And that ain't easy. But just like you get the king of Babylon's ears, this guy got Stalin's ears. And even though what Lysenko believed about agriculture was a bunch of nonsense, Stalin put his faith in Lysenko. Today you would call it understanding science, because Lysenko determined what science was in the Soviet Union, because Stalin told the people this is the way it is. Lysenko is science. The problem is Lysenko was full of crap, and a lot of people died because of it. A lot of people didn't eat. Since then, the same kind of tactics have been used with the Big Bang Theory, with a lot of astrophysics, just a ton of most astrophysics, I would dare say. Evolution, of course, which it was just one of the worst theories ever to begin with, but with the modern discoveries we have had, particularly with DNA and such, it boggles my mind that anyone can even maintain a belief in that, even with a cult mentality. Evolution has been destroyed for a long time. And of course, anti-smoking, where they claim that it's you smoke this cigarette, you're going to die. If you smoke, then you get cancer. If you smoke, then you'll get emphysema. Oh, really? Well, what about most of these smokers over here who don't have any of that stuff? Well, they They could get it. You can't say that they can't get it. Some of them are going to get it. It's like, well, I thought you said all of them. If you smoke, then you get. You see how this just, and then they just come up and they make their little excuses over and over and over again. But the one thing they can't do is what the scientific method requires, which is to predict precisely what is going to happen. This person will get cancer. They will get it when they smoke their 4,713th cigarette. It will be this type of cancer. It will grow at this rate. It will metastasize in such and such manner. They don't have anything that resembles that kind of predictive ability, which is required by the scientific method. They just say, if you smoke, then you get cancer. And what do you get? You get 7 billion people around the world who know nothing about science going, oh my God, don't start smoking, you're going to get cancer. To me, climate change is the same thing as anti-smoking. You just replace tobacco with climate change. They're exactly the same. The anti-smokers built the modern playbook of how to take things like evolution, Big Bang, Lysenkoism, eugenics, and to institutionalize it in a way that the so-called scientists are elevated to positions of, second in charge, without being elected to office, by the way. That's how you end up with one of the most influential scientists of the 20th century being Al Gore, who made a rotten documentary film, one of the most shameful films I've ever seen. For someone who understands science, watching that film was a torture chamber. Everything in there, I could just see what the problems were, one after another. Everyone around me completely oblivious to it. This also fits in with another one of our existential threats, which is our rotten education system. If people are not educated to understand these things and to critically think, they're not going to recognize when they're being taken advantage of and exploited by these charlatans. Academia is a cult. If you're in academia, if you're in those ivory towers, you don't interact with the normal world throughout your life. You might think you do because you go snowboarding or you go out amongst the tribes, the primitive tribes of the Amazon to do your sociological research. And then you come back to your warm and comfortable home and write and publish your papers with peer review. But those so-called primitive tribes are living that from the time they're born till the time they die. And yet this academic thinks they know something about these people. You see how that works. Academia is... personally, I think anti-smoking itself has been the most dangerous thing of the 20th century because it built the playbook that's used by so many other junk scientists. They designed the weapon. They designed it. They built this intellectual nuclear bomb that climate change scientists and everyone else keeps setting off, destroying people's ability to think. To me, that's dangerous. But they came out of academia, or I should say they infiltrated academia and they kind of took it over from within. But so the question is, what is a scientist anyway? What is a scientist? What is science, for that matter? And you can look at all the definitions you want, but it should be pretty intuitive. Science is some kind of formal investigation of the world that you live in to discover the truth about that world, about how that world operates and functions. The truth. And if you look at science that way, honestly, one thing you're going to realize is that you may not get all the answers before your time in this world's over. Today, to become a scientist, you only have to do two things. Two things. Now, there might be some preliminaries to make one of those happen, like you might have to go to school and get a degree. But there's only two things you actually have to do. One is call yourself a scientist, and the other is to get the cult of academia to confirm that you're a scientist. That's it. It doesn't matter if everything you believe is wrong. It doesn't matter if you were trained completely incompetently. It doesn't matter if your theories have nothing to do with reality. If you call yourself a scientist and academia confirms that and backs it up, then you're a scientist. End of story. But if you're someone sitting in their basement and you're doing real research that obeys the scientific method, and you come up with something that these people don't like and they're never going to let anyone else hear it, you're not a scientist. Even though you're doing science, you see how that works, right? Again, academia is a cult. And the truth is, you can kind of skip number one. You don't even need to call yourself a scientist. If you can get academia to call you a scientist, bang, you're a scientist. That's how a cult works. You want to be a priest? How do you become a priest? Do you just call yourself a priest, or does the congregation have to confirm that you are a priest? Because if they stop believing that you're a priest, all your authority's gone. Your knowledge hasn't changed. Your knowledge of God and the scriptures and everything hasn't changed. It's because everyone believes that you're a priest. That's what these scientists are. They're priests of the religions of academia. What we have today is not Isaac Newton, who, by the way, was known as a theologian, not a scientist. He was a guy who sat in his basement and did incredibly good science. But back then, he was able to publish it. And when he published it and people went out and analyzed it and critically reviewed it, they found that he was right. So in hindsight, we look at him as a scientist, but at the time, he was looked at as a theologian. And that's interesting how the best scientists throughout history, those people on my walls, they believed in God. You see, they were trying to determine how this world works because they were trying to understand the mind of God. They were trying to understand how the world works that God created. That's how you help to understand who God is. And because of that, they wanted to know the truth. They didn't want to know something that backed up their ideas and their theories and their pet projects. They wanted to know the absolute truth, because if they knew anything other than the truth, they're going to be misinformed about who God is. And that's why we went through that period of magnificent scientists who, it turns out, were all pretty religious, weren't they? In our day and age, what do we have? Instead of that, we have people like Isaac Asimov, Carl Sagan, who packed me all full of disinformation when I was a kid. Neil deGrasse Tyson, the heir apparent to Carl Sagan's empire, who, from what I can tell, did absolutely nothing. He just stepped into Carl Sagan's shoes and started walking. Bill Nye, this guy with the bow tie, who is the only reason I wouldn't want to debate him, well, there's a couple of reasons. One, there's no point to it. He just doesn't, he's not looking for truth from what I can tell, but he's just a nasty person. And sometimes, even if someone claims to have the miracle cure or the answers, or they've got something that a priest can give you, if they're just a nasty, rotten person, I'd rather they just stayed away. I don't want to be near them. Why should I waste my life on someone like that? Stephen Jay Gould, again, I can't see what he did. Punctuated equilibrium, whatever. Doesn't make any sense either. He didn't contribute anything to science. And I hate to do this to you folks, I really do. Because there was a time when I had respect for him as well, when he came out with A Brief History of Time, that book. Stephen Hawking, that guy didn't do anything. Show me what he did. If I say Einstein, you're going to go E equals MC squared. You know what he did. What did Hawking actually do? See, these are celebrity pop culture icons. And while they might work in academia, where academia calls them scientists, you can't show me what they actually did. The other thing you need to understand junk science is something that scientists themselves don't seem to understand, and especially science writers in the media do not understand, which is the difference, the fundamental big difference between science and technology. See, technology can be founded on science, it can use science, it can build upon science, but it doesn't have to. Give you an example. You want to build a better mousetrap. You put some mousetraps that you build out there, but they're just not catching mice. So you go and you start experimenting with different metals and different things. And you find that if you have a spring that's more tightly wound, it snaps down a lot harder. And it catches more mice than the one you had before, which was really loose, and the mouse could scamper away. Now, you may not understand anything about the science of the 6 simple machines, how levers work or anything. You may not understand anything about tension and torque, and you don't understand the science of how a spring works or anything. But you can build a better mousetrap, a mousetrap that works 10 times better. That's technology. Now, you may understand all the science behind it. That's great. But the point is, you're building a mousetrap. That's technology. The technology that we've seen in the 20th century, where we go from horse and buggy to cars like the one I live in, and airplanes, spaceships, probes that can go all the way out to Pluto, that's technology. And yes, there is some scientific basis to it, But there's a difference between science and technology. Technology builds upon itself as much as it builds upon science. So if you have people like the Wright brothers, they're looking, how do they say, well, the birds can fly, therefore we can fly. We just have to figure out how. We can have powered flight. So to figure it out, we're going to watch how the birds work. We're going to figure this out. Everyone else is saying it's impossible. Humans can't fly. It's not possible. The scientists would say it's impossible. But the Wright brothers would say they didn't understand all the details, the scientific mathematics of aerodynamics, and they didn't understand that. Fluid mechanics, things like that. They just experimented with technology, and a lot of these people who were trying to build planes back then paid with their lives. They went up, and they came down, according to the laws of Isaac Newton that he discovered. They came down the hard way, and they lost their lives. The Wright brothers did not. They just happened to be the ones who managed to figure it out. But they were not brilliant scientists. They were developing a technology. But they kind of sort of looked at science, especially God made birds who could fly. If the birds can fly, let's try to mimic what the birds are doing. Let's try to figure out why their wings are there. What are their wings actually doing? And they didn't have things like high-speed photography to figure that out. It's an amazing accomplishment what they did. There's such a big difference between science and technology, and yet we've seen technology just skyrocket throughout the 20th century into today. And the masses who don't understand science, they make an assumption that science has also skyrocketed like that. But instead, what science has done is it was doing great through the period of these heroes of mine, Kepler and Galileo and Isaac Newton and all that. Then there came some really brilliant people, Maxwell, and I mean, science was doing extraordinary. And then you got to Einstein, who, to me, was kind of half right and half wrong. And at that point, when the junk science started to take over everything, scientific advancement itself tanked. Now, there's a few disciplines within science that kept going pretty well because they couldn't be corrupted, or it was not in anyone's interest to corrupt it. Aerodynamics, okay, learning how to make a heavier than air flight, powered flight, learning how fluid mechanics, these kinds of things. If you're going to be trying to learn those things, there isn't a big benefit, there isn't a good way to make money or to manipulate and dictate the terms of other people's existences by cooking the books when it comes to aerodynamics. There's just no benefit to it. When it comes to medicine, oh yeah, you can make trillions of dollars, and you, some putz who just calls himself a scientist, can dictate the terms of existence of 7 billion people on this planet. You, a nobody, can force people at the government's gunpoint to do what you tell them to do because you have convinced the government, who are a bunch of ignorant people as well, that you're a scientist. But that doesn't happen in things like that. It doesn't happen in electronics to speak of. That's why computer technology took off like a rocket, and the science that underlies it really took off. Also, they are based on laws that are really not something you can break easily. Ohm's law, the laws of electronics and everything, the laws of aerodynamics, they can't be broken, they can't be fudged, they can't be faked. And there's no purpose to it. There's no benefit for a junk scientist to do that. You want to only go for areas of science where you can use what you're doing to manipulate human beings, because ultimately that's what a junk scientist is about. Their main concern is people, not science. They're not seeking the real truth about the world they live in. Their main goal ultimately is to somehow influence other people, either to influence their beliefs. I don't believe in God, and I think you're crazy to believe in God, so I want you to believe in evolution. So my whole life's dedicated to making sure that you believe in evolution. Not proving evolution, but making sure that you believe in evolution. And that you think, while you're going through this belief, this faith, you think that instead what you're doing is you're understanding and accepting science. See, it's always about other people, not the science, not understanding the truth about the world. If you hate smoking with the passion of a Michael Bloomberg, when he was a smoker, everyone on planet Earth is able to smoke, no problem. Once he quit smoking, what's he do? No one else on the face of the earth is allowed to smoke anymore. So So he runs for mayor of New York, never even mentions anti-smoking throughout the campaign. Becomes mayor, bam, immediately imposes a smoking ban on millions of people in New York City. Never even mentioned it. Now he's running for president. I wonder what he's not telling you now that he's going to spring on you the day after his inauguration. You see, if you're a megalomaniac, if your main goal is not truth, understanding whether smoking is dangerous or how it might be, but your main goal is, I'm Michael Bloomberg. I stopped smoking, therefore you have to stop smoking because I'm Michael Bloomberg. You see, I'm me. You're just, I don't even know your name. You're nobody. You're the masses. You're the ignorant hordes. Kind of like the way Hitler or Stalin looked at people, other people. Just the rabble. Just people to be used and manipulated, consumed, discarded, destroyed. Like all the other trash out there. See, that's the problem when you have a narcissistic megalomaniac who gets into science or what they call science. Their main goal is to manipulate other people. Michael Bloomberg is not a scientist, and yet he'll spend $120 million of his own money on anti-smoking. Why? Because his main goal is not learning the truth about anything. It's dictating the terms of existence of people who may want to smoke. And it's the same thing with everything else up to climate change. Nothing to do with understanding the reality of this world. We want you to lower your carbon footprint. We want to tax you and collect the money that you work to earn, using the government's gun to collect it for us so that we keep a safe distance. And even though we're the ones causing this and we're the ones benefiting from it, there's all these degrees of separation through government between you, the victim, and me, the perpetrator. These are not scientists, folks. News media science writers. Something kind of new. Isaac Asimov was one of the innovators of that, where, again, I really appreciate what Asimov did for me as a writer. He helped me to learn how to write and explain things in a way that people can understand much better than I could before. But what he was believing the scientists at face value, so all he did was regurgitate what they told him. And even as I read his books, there were times I would just go, that doesn't make any sense. And I wanted to believe Isaac Asimov, and I didn't understand why it didn't make sense until I was older. But if you just read it at face value, you're essentially reading a Bible. It's faith. It's not science. It's faith. It's a religion. These science writers they have today in the media, these yahoos they've got in Minnesota, I mean, look at all the science writing. By definition, you know, one of the things these scientists always say is that, well, you're ignorant. You're not well educated, you don't have a PhD, you don't have my years of experience, my publications, you don't have all this stuff, you don't know what you're talking about if you challenge them. That's their answer. And yet, these same people will pump so much of our national resources into broadcasting science to these same ignorant hordes. You know, the people who are too dumb to figure anything out. Why would you do that? PBS, documentaries on all kinds of cable channels. Popular books like A Brief History of Time from Hawking or Cosmos by Carl Sagan. The education in our school system. These science writers in newspapers. You're reading a newspaper and you see a story. Scientists claim that dinosaurs may have been killed by blah, 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 blah. Okay, if all of this is addressing these ignorant hordes who are too uneducated and don't have all this esoteric knowledge that the scientists have so that they can't understand anything anyway, then why are you telling them? Why are you devoting billions and billions and billions of dollars to propagating this stuff to these people who you yourself claim are too dumb to even understand it? The reason is because you're not teaching them science. You're indoctrinating them with beliefs. And if your goal is to indoctrinate other people with beliefs, you're not doing science. You're not interested in science. You're not interested in knowing the truth. You're interested in affecting other human beings. You've got a psychological problem. One of the things you'll see in the media all the time, look at the headlines for science. When they talk about studies, they'll come up with all these vague words. If you look at my recent video on vaping, the great vaping scare of 2019, I took one of these ridiculous science articles from the Star Tribune, and I went through the whole article. And the thing is filled with vague generalities. May cause this, might do this, can possibly have this effect. should. They're using all these vague words all the time. They're not coming out and saying, this will do this. If you smoke a cigarette, you will get cancer. They don't say that. Why? Because if you smoke a cigarette, you're not going to get cancer. What they want is a bunch of ignorant fools out there who believe what they tell. They want them to go on YouTube and make videos. And you'll see it all the time. It goes to my other upcoming video about the exploitation of children. You'll see all these kids in school who are told to make videos. And I focus on anti-smoking because it's the worst of the bunch, in my opinion. But they'll have these kids come out there, they'll make a video, they'll roll up a piece of paper, and they'll pretend to smoke a cigarette, and then they'll start coughing, and they'll fall down on the ground, and then all their friends will walk over and throw flowers on them and start crying, oh my God, they died. They smoke one cigarette, they die. See, that's what these kids believe. Meanwhile, you got people smoking for 80, 90 years, and they haven't died yet. When all kinds of things should have killed them by now. Same thing with climate change. Climate change, since 1960, there have been something like, there's been dozens, more than 3 dozen at least, specific predictions, these climate change. And this goes for back when they said that we're going to freeze, back in the 70s, we're going into an ice age, to when they switched it around completely to global warming. Now they call it climate change. Every time they get caught, they change the terminology. Throughout all of that period, they have made all these specific predictions. This particular island is going to be underwater by the year 1978. Not one of them has come true. And one of the definitions of the scientific method is that your predictions always come true. That's science. With climate change, they haven't hit it yet once that I'm aware of. Now you can hit it just by random chance. All you have to do is make your prediction very vague. That's how a psychic works. That's how an astrologer works. They're good at playing people. They come up, I feel like you have a relative with a name that starts with a J. Well, let's see, Janelle, John, Jacob, Jason, Janet. You see what I mean? And yet someone they're like, oh my gosh, my aunt Janet, she died 3 years ago. Yes, Janet, that's who it is. I feel her presence here. That's what these scientists are doing. If they put out a prediction that's vague so that it flip a coin, it might happen, it might not happen, but it has nothing to do with them understanding it or predicting it. They just made it vague. But what about all these specific predictions? This island will be underwater by this year. What about AOC? Within 12 years, we're all going to be dead. Not one of these specific predictions has come true, which is your first indication that it's junk science. And before I get into specifics here, another thing to look at, again, going back to anti-smoking. Next time you go to your doctor, if you smoke, tell them, boy, I sure love smoking. I'm so glad. I'm so grateful for tobacco. It just makes my life so much more pleasant. And watch him go, and just start giving you the business. If you don't smoke, then lie. Just say, doctor, I started smoking recently. I gotta admit, I really enjoy this. You can't do that. Think about the children. We're all gonna die. Comets, asteroids, locusts. And watch him go on. Once he gets going on his tirade and he starts telling you why you need to stop smoking, at that point, again, whether you smoke or not, just get him going on it. But after he starts telling you the way it is, interrupt him and say, doctor, would you please tell me the last time that you read an anti-smoking study published in a journal, and when you read it, did you research the validity of it? Did you validate whether or not this was a legitimate study, that the peer review was done properly? And just sit back and see what they say. Because that doctor, that person who you trust with your children's lives, if not 9 out of 10 times, 10 out of 10 times, they're going to say, you know what, I've got another appointment. I'm sorry, I don't have time for this. Because you're going to be hard-pressed to find it. You know what, a doctor works enough hours as it is, and then when they get out of work, like anyone else, they want to go play basketball, they want to hang out with their families, they want to go out and do what they want to do. They're believing whatever they're told by the people who control them. That's why there's so much malpractice. That's why there's so many people who die at the hands of doctors. And there always has been. one of the deadliest professions out there. You show me a general practitioner who will tell you all about smoking. You show me one who has even read and validated one scientific study on smoking and health, let alone all of them. They don't do it because you know what? In order to do it, it takes a long, long time. You have to research a lot of things. You have to dust for fingerprints. You have to find what they're hiding. Especially in anti-smoking, where they're so good at it. They've had more than 50 years to just perfect this fraud of theirs. So what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to give you some rules that I wrote out, and I just wrote these out before I made this video off the top of my head. Again, my research is packed away, but that's how easy I can recollect a lot of this stuff. It may not be formulated as well as I wish I could present to you, but it's all I got. I'm stuck living in a car. But these are ways that you can identify a junk scientist. You can identify a junk scientist. And I'm so sorry, there is one thing before I do that. I have to give you rule number one of legitimate science. Rule number one of legitimate science is that it is impossible to know everything. There are some things we cannot know. No matter how much research you do, no matter how much you want to know it, there's some things we can't know. In particular, things that concern time. When you're looking in the past, you don't know what happened in the past that might interfere with what you're observing. To give you an example, imagine that the police are called and they're told that someone's been murdered and put in this shed that's outside someone's house. The police arrive, and what do they see? They see two sets of footprints coming from the house, because it had just snowed, right? It had just snowed recently within the last 12 hours. They see two sets of footprints going from the house to the shed, and then they see one set of footprints and some drops of blood going back from the shed to the house. When they go into the shed, they find a dead body. When they test the blood of that, they find that the blood drops in the snow are from that body. And what do? They go in, they arrest the homeowner, they put him on trial, they convict him, and he's either in prison for the rest of his life or he gets the death penalty. The problem is, you see, all of these people are focused on the dead body. They're trying to figure out about the murder. What they're not thinking is that there's some lunatic out there who his goal has nothing to do with the dead body. That was just something that they had to do to make this happen. Their goal is to put away the homeowner. They hate the homeowner, so they're going to frame the homeowner. So what did they do? They grabbed their boots at some point, made impressions of it, then they made plaster cast of it. They got a drone, and the drone went from the house and imprinted all these footprints. Then he put another plaster cast of the victim's footprints, made another set of prints next to it. Then they used the drone to imprint the homeowner's footprints back to the house, and then the drone took some of the victim's blood and dropped it along the way. Never had to touch the ground. But because the investigators are not scientists, they're not critical thinkers, they don't think, hey, there might be another possibility than what looks like it's obvious. They put that other person in prison for the rest of their lives, or they send them to the electric chair. Meanwhile, the actual perpetrator, the murderer of this body in the shed, is sitting off in the distance and no one even knows that they exist. And if you think that's far-fetched, you might look up a serial killer like in Israel Keys, for example. There are people who are that meticulous in what they do. Along those lines, I would like to point out one example of where science and technology together have done something magnificent. It's called the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project has used DNA technology to exonerate people who were sent to prison or to death row for crimes that they did not commit. And you're going to be amazed at how many people they have freed. Hundreds of them. And they're only a tiny portion of the people sitting in our prisons who did not commit the crimes they're in there for. That's something to think about the next time you want to just blindly believe a scientist who tells you such and such is the way it is. Because they're in control of the presentation. They're in control of how those footprints and the blood drops get distributed amongst the newly fallen snow. They're in control of the phone call to the police to tell them that there's a body in the shed before the homeowner finds out, where the homeowner would have called the police. That's what junk scientists do, to our collective detriment. And with that, I have to get ready to go to work, so I can't even start on my 19 or so ways to identify a junk scientist. So I'm going to stop the video here and create part 2, I guess, of this, or the rest of this video later. Alright, thanks for watching this far.
Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society.